Welcome to the Greg Bennett Show. I'm your host, Greg Bennett. And today, I have on one of my all-time favorite guests, Dr. Tommy Wood, back on the show. He's been on the show numerous times. If you haven't listened to his episodes, go back and listen to them. They're absolutely fantastic. He takes often what we overcomplicate and he really simplifies it for the rest of us. And I just think the way he thinks, the way he speaks, I thoroughly get a lot out of these conversations, and I think you will too. We discuss everything from performing under suboptimal conditions to building resilience, hot and cold therapy, fasting, goals and visualizing, gratitude, and everything else. It's just such a fantastic episode. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. And remember, success comes to those who endure just one moment longer. All right. Well, today's guest, he's a familiar voice on the show. He brings just such wealth of knowledge into human health and performance and longevity with his background in biochemistry, medicine, physiology, and neuroscience. But he's not just an academic, researcher, and professor. He's also an athlete himself, and he understands the practical side of human performance. And he's just been such a guiding light on this show. And for me personally, the amount of times I've just called him offline and said, hey, mate, what do you think? Everything from whether we're talking about building resilience or ancestral living or the nitty-gritty of hot and cold therapy, which I hope to get into a little bit today as well. It's just so great to have him as a friend, as a mate, somebody I can bounce ideas on, but also somebody who can come and join us on this show. So without further ado, thanks for joining me on the Greg Bennett Show. Once again, the brilliant, the incredible Dr. Tommy Wood. How are you, mate?
Oh, wow. What an intro. Yeah, I've got a lot to live up to now, but likewise, it's always so fun to chat with you both on here and in all the other ways that we interact. So really appreciate the invite and all your kind words. And I'm super excited to be back on the show.
Yeah, mate, it's great to have you. And I think it's been, it's over a year. I don't know. It's like we were just saying pre-show. I think this is your 5th time on the show, which puts you in, I don't think there's only a couple. I think maybe Jan Frodeno, maybe Alistair Brownlee, a couple of names, big names in the sporting world. But otherwise, mate, I think you're right up there with the most I've had on the show. So I appreciate you. How's the year been? What have you been up to? Anything new?
It's actually been a really good year. Doing all the things that academics do. Getting grant proposals funded so I can fund my lab, writing interesting papers, interesting collaborations. Some big projects I can't talk about yet, but I was super excited to have in the running that will sort of take shape over the next couple of years. So yeah, it's been a really good year.
Yeah, I can sense big things on the horizon for you, mate. It's like I think we've even talked about you and your business and everything else, because I look at the Hubermans of the world or the Peter Attias and I go, no. I've got someone better. not to say they're not incredible. I'm not meaning to rubbish them, but I've always looked at you as somebody that is still, the potential is enormous. And anything I can do to help in the future, I'd love to be able to help. But mate, it's been a year since we last spoke. We have a lot to cover. I sent you a list and I'm like, probably every one of these topics we could spend an hour on, but, everything from, performing under suboptimal conditions to building resilience. And then personally for me, I've sort of said, hey, can we talk more about hot cold therapy and fasting and goals and visualizing and everything else? But there's a lot there to unpack. But before we do, how about a quick recap of your journey, where you've been and what you're up to and where you're actually working now?
Sure. So my day job, as I call it, is as an assistant professor of pediatrics and neuroscience at the University of Washington in Seattle. Practically what that means is I run a basic neuroscience lab where we try to study ways to treat the injured brain. And that is brain injury in babies, but we also do more and more work in traumatic brain injury and concussion, because that's an area where I've intersected with a lot, particularly with athletes and the military as well. And then I'm also increasingly interested in how those things affect long-term brain health, and what can we do to decrease the risk of cognitive decline, dementia, long-term. Then kind of intersecting into a lot of that is work that I've done over the past, I don't know, nearly 2 decades now, increasingly with athletes. So first as an athlete myself, and then as a coach to athletes, and then working in some digital health companies supporting the health and performance of athletes. And now I work primarily with Formula One drivers through the company Hinsa Performance. So I've kind of had these 2 streams of my career, one that's sort of more medical and very academic, and then one that's more applied in the sort of performance spheres. And now what's nice about my job is that I basically get to do whatever I like, as long as I can keep my lab funded and I can keep paying my own salary. And so a lot of what I work on now is this intersection between what it takes to create a healthy brain or treat an injured brain, and what it takes to sustain long-term health and performance, and all the ways that we can do that.
Wow, I love how you've just described that. And last episode, when you were last on, we did talk a lot about how we can train the brain, much like we train the physical body. And that was a fascinating episode. If people haven't listened to that one, it's really quite incredible, from doing interval training and rest and recovery and everything else. Is that still a topic that you've been fascinated in?
Absolutely. And it's something that I'm doing more and more of in that kind of long-term cognitive function space. So I've written some papers, writing some more papers, trying to, with large collaborative groups of experts, trying to build what we call a systems model of long-term both cognitive function and dementia prevention. Some of that I do with a good friend of mine who's a neurologist, Dr. Josh Turknett, and we both work as part of a group that's trying to create some sort of social media campaigns and other campaigns around dementia prevention, and the simple things that we can do to achieve that. And what Josh and I have focused a lot on is this demand model, or demand coupling model of how the brain functions, which essentially says, just like your muscles, the way you train and use your brain is probably the primary driver of how your brain functions. Of course, you then need to sleep and move and all these other things that support those processes. But how we use our brains is something that I think has been underappreciated. And then part of that work dovetails into work with a dementia prevention charity in the UK called Food for the Brain, where they actually have a big database of people who've done online cognitive function tests, and they've also answered questionnaires about their lifestyle. And so we're now building this big research database that I'm the principal investigator of, so that we can actually, in large groups of people, start to figure out some ideas of how these different aspects of lifestyle and the environment interact and affect cognitive function and long-term risk of dementia. Are
there any sort of big takeaways that you can share with us from the study that, because I know when we talk about dementia, it's like, I think what did I hear the other day? Well, a while back, but the number one fear that people have is Alzheimer's or dementia, and then death is number 2, right? And so I have to ask, like, is there something that you're finding through your research, through your studies, through your conversations that says, hey, if you do this X, Y, and Z, it reduces this chances of dementia by this amount?
Depending on who you ask and the studies that you look at, it's now thought that anywhere from like 40% to maybe more than 70% of dementia is entirely preventable.
Wow.
And the American Academy of Neurology recently released a position statement that said, like, now is the era of preventative neurology. So like, not this big, fancy, slightly dusty academic body even acknowledging that we have a huge amount of ability to prevent dementia at the population level. Of course, we can't say right now, if this person does these things, they will never get dementia. But certainly if we can start to implement these things at the population level, we would expect to see dramatic reductions in in overall prevalence of dementia.
So what are those things?
Yeah, so
don't hold out on me.
The way that it depends on who you ask, and it's funny because in each study they focus on slightly different things, which makes it difficult to really figure out, what's the. Sometimes you think they use this term population attributable risk, which basically says that if everybody in the population did this thing, what percentage would we reduce dementia by at the population level?
Right.
And everybody has slightly different answers, but some of the main things include physical activity, preventing and partly through that, preventing adverse changes in body composition, which usually means a loss of muscle mass and excess fat mass, smoking, not drinking too much alcohol, education is a really important risk factor that's maybe not individually modifiable, but is definitely modifiable at the population level.
What do you mean education? What do you mean by education?
Yeah, so the most protective early life factor for your long-term risk of dementia is how many years you spend in school, your formal education level.
Oh, you'll be alive. You'll never get dementia, mate. Didn't you?
Yeah, I spent my entire life as a student. Maybe that's why. Maybe that's why I like those data.
Yeah.
So there's two parts of that. One is that, right, if you spend more time in education, you probably come from a more privileged background. You have better access to food or higher quality food. You're more likely to have access to exercise and the time to do it. You're less likely to smoke, less likely to drink a lot. So there's a lot about the social environment that is baked into that. But equally, if you spend more time in education, you're going to have a higher income long term. But so there's all those parts, and that's something that we have to change at the population level, right? We should allow everybody to have access to the level of education that they want and not make it prohibitive, because we know that's going to protect their brains long term. And part of that, I think, is because of the way education and the active skill of learning directly stimulates the brain. So I talked about how we use our brains is probably one of the most important factors in terms of long-term risk of cognitive decline. And our level of cognitive function tends to peak right around when we finish formal education. So it keeps on increasing on average the more time we spend in education, because that's when we're actually actively stimulating our brains. And then once we leave formal education, we tend to stimulate our brains less and less, and then cognitive function declines alongside that. So that kind of educational cognitive stimulation, and that's something that we could do late in life. We talk a bunch about that on the last podcast, like skill learning, language learning, physical activity, coordination type movement, or like all the ways that's beneficial for the brain. But then it also relates to other risk factors like cataracts, hearing loss. Like if you lose these inputs into the brain, that's associated with higher risk of dementia. So get cataract surgery if you have cataracts. Get a hearing aid if you have some presbyacusis, age-related hearing loss. So those are listed as formal risk factors in some of these studies. Nutrient status is important. B vitamin status, omega-3, vitamin D, probably magnesium. So eating a high-quality nutrient-rich diet is important. That's probably most of them.
That's awesome. That's a great summary, mate. And I appreciate that, because I didn't say we were ever going to talk about this, but I think when we spoke about last time, we even concluded at the end that learning to dance was almost the ultimate thing that we could be doing, because it was physical, it required learning, it had the music element, it had coordination, it had all of those things. Social
interaction is very important. The social component.
Yeah, I've said that to Laura. She's all excited about going and getting dance lessons. But I've been...
Are you going to go learn the tango with her?
You know what, mate? I'm just such a natural mover. It's hard for me to follow steps. I like to be just free flow, mate. I'm free flow. I like to just feel the music. I'm not told how to step into it. Do you do dance? Are you doing dance?
No, I don't. But I would really like to learn something like the tango. Every time I think about the tango, I think about that scene in True Lies. With Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jamie Lee Curtis. I'm like, that's cool. I'd love to be able to do that.
I did learn dance at school way back. university. And then I did some. It was called Ciroc Modern Jive. I did that for a number of years. So I did actually spend some time doing dance classes, and it is a lot of fun, especially when you're in your early 20s and you're wanting to meet girls. It was great. The social part, I should say, was fantastic. But mate, let's shift gear a little bit. I want to discuss, and you brought up with me when we were preparing for this chat, about performing under less than ideal conditions. And I want you to sort of dive into sort of what you see is crucial in this kind of way that we prepare ourselves in this fast-paced world, that we're all trying to optimize our lives all the time and looking for optimal. It's a word that I know that makes you cringe a little bit. And I want you to just explain to me what is it about being, because I use it a lot. And so you're probably going to slap me across the face. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of living in this world where we're all searching for optimal living, optimal lives. We're all trying to be perfect. Tell me your thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, this is something that I've thought about a lot over the last 10 years or so. And I definitely used to be the person who was like, optimize each of these things individually. Like, here's all your blood tests. Here's how you can optimize all of them. Like, here's all these lifestyle factors. Here's how you can optimize them. And the more time I guess I spend not thinking about these things academically, but thinking about these things in an applied fashion and working with people who are applying these things in different contexts, the more I think that that's not the right approach for most people. There's a few reasons for that. The first is that for a lot of things, we don't know what optimal is, if there is even an optimal. And so we're kind of making very significant decisions and interventions based on very imperfect data that often don't even relate to the person we're applying them to. So as an example, there are ways to think about how certain blood tests are associated with certain health outcomes, and those are based on sort of average population data. And you might say, okay, in this blood sugar range, like this is where we see the lowest risk of heart disease and diabetes or dementia, all-cause mortality. So just like the overall risk of dying. And I think that's important, again, when we think about these things at the population level, but for a given individual, that might not be that useful. And that's often because the people that we're applying this to, which tends to be young, fit, generally healthy, generally well-off individuals, those aren't the kinds of people that end up in these databases that we use to generate these data. Often they try and sample truly average people. And so then the average person has prediabetes or diabetes, has at least one chronic health condition, and takes at least one medication chronically. Right? That's the average person. And there's, I have no value judgment about that.
It just is.
It's an output of the world that we live in. But if you try and take data from those people and apply it to somebody like me or you, we just, for various reasons, we don't fit that demographic. So that's the first issue, is like, what data are we using to decide what is optimal in the first place? And then the next thing is, how do you approach the idea of optimization? So in order to optimize, you have to do two things, generally. One is you have to objectify a certain process. So you have to attach numbers to it. And this is important because when we objectify things, then we get less of the subjective benefits from them. So to remove some of the sciencey speak, what that means is, if you spend a bunch of time thinking about optimizing your meals, you decrease the joy you get from sharing a nice meal with your family and friends. And we do this with sleep, we do it with food, we do it with exercise. So I think by objectifying these things, we're decreasing the subjective benefits, which often is due to social interaction with others and the general joy that these things should be associated with.
Yeah, I like that.
And then if you're trying to optimize something, that necessitates you telling yourself that you are suboptimal. And there are now several studies in multiple different spheres that say if you are constantly telling yourself you're not doing enough or you're not good enough, this negatively affects your physiology and your health. You can measure it in terms of stress responses, in terms of it changes our immune systems. And again, this is to do with the influence of social interaction and social rank, like where we perceive ourselves in the rank of the humans around us. And that's one of the reasons why social media is potentially problematic, is you spend all this time looking at other people who are richer, more handsome, more jacked than you are. And so you are automatically thinking about how you're not as good as they are. And that negatively affects your health and physiology. So that's another reason why I don't like this continued quest for optimization, is because it requires you to constantly think about how you're not good enough, and that can negatively affect your health.
It's almost like an athlete mindset. Sorry to interrupt. It's like that athlete mindset of pushing. It's like, well, where are you going? I say this to actually all the, I've got a 4 and a 6-year-old. Sorry to interrupt, but it's like all the parents are pushing their kids so hard. And remember a couple of episodes ago, you told me to read the book Coddling of the American Mind.
Yeah.
Blew me away. I recommend it to every single parent I meet now. It's like all you're doing is pushing this resume building in your children. Just let them be kids. Anyway, I'm sorry to interrupt. I've gone astray. Keep going, mate.
No. So that's all essentially it. Like those are the issues that I have with the optimization mindset. And then we didn't talk about wearables and some things where there's plenty of studies that show that if you give somebody imperfect data, that will affect their performance more than the actual thing that they're measuring. So particularly around sleep.
Yes.
So those are the many reasons why I've become less of a fan of optimization. And what I think is more important, particularly as I work with athletes, but also those in like the military setting, say, is that the most important thing is to be able to perform as well as you can, not under optimal conditions, but under suboptimal conditions. So if you're constantly striving for optimal, the other downside is that you would be like, well, these are all the things that I need to get the best amount of sleep and perform my best the next day. And the thing is that 99 times out of 100, you're not going to be able to achieve that. So then if you're like, well, I didn't sleep properly and I didn't do this thing and I didn't get to do my 37-point morning routine that sets me up for optimal cognitive function at 9:30 in the morning, right? Then you will perform worse because you're thinking about how you didn't do everything optimally.
This is music to my ears, Tommy. This is music to my ears. I'm telling you. Oh, go on. I've got some. I don't want to interrupt again, but this is so great. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, it all reminds me of this is that famous Mike Tyson quote, which is that everybody has a plan until they're punched in the face.
Yes.
And so that's exactly how I feel. I think that we should absolutely. We all have things that we can improve that will improve our health, will improve our cognitive function, will improve our sleep, right? And when we have control over those things, we should control them because long term, I believe they'll have benefit. But much more important is being able to perform well when we've been punched in the face. So it's when you haven't slept properly, or when you haven't been able to exercise the way you like, or you haven't been able to have your coffee in the morning, which is obviously devastating for my cognitive function, but as my wife will tell you. But these are the things that I think we should be striving for is building, then it's about building resilience in the system so that we know we can perform well when things don't go our way, or we haven't got control over the variables that we'd like to have control over. So then you think about all these important aspects of lifestyle that build resilience. There can be physical activity. You want to talk about hot and cold. So like these, or I think some of the benefits that you might get from from fasting are oversold, but it's a difficult thing. And knowing that you can do difficult things and you can still perform well when you haven't eaten as much as you'd like to, or you haven't gotten your perfect macros or whatever, and that you can still perform. I think knowing that is really important for your ability to perform when you're then stressed or things don't go your way. So that's the way that I prefer to think about it. Yeah, we can all take some supplements to improve our nutrient status, and we can all sleep better when we have access to it, and we can all do better physical activity maybe to increase our overall fitness and resilience. But the goal should be performance under suboptimal conditions rather than expecting everything to be optimal all the time.
Oh, mate. So in response to that, I was talking to you, before you hit the record button, we built and sold Any Question to Whoop, who you mentioned. And so I decided to do the whole sign-up process for Whoop, and they're doing a 30-day free trial. And I wanted to come in more from the tech and the app side and the growth side and going, okay, how does it work? And I just got pages of notes, right? Because I'd never worn a Whoop before, and I wanted to know what it was like. And I talked to a lot of guys, in the sauna or at the gym or whatever that were wearing Whoops and tell me what they think. And other guys saying, I had a Whoop, and I didn't like to be told that my score was low in the morning. It was like reinforcing, to your point, that I'm suboptimal.
Yeah.
And so for my main things that I wrote Whoop and said, look, a lot of great things about the product. So, and happy to give it a really good try and give it. But I said, the biggest thing I want is, I know I've had a crappy sleep. I don't need a thing on, but what I'd love is, hey, Greg, and they're building their AI now, actually. So in fairness to Whoop, they're building their AI coach, which is actually starting to do this. Greg, yeah, you and I both know you've had a crappy sleep, mate. Get outside, barefoot, ground yourself. Or here's some tips. Go outside, ground yourself, maybe practice some gratitude, do something nice for somebody else, take 5 deep breaths, splash some cold water on your face, and get on with your day.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is a useful tool. Like a little, hey, this is your day. You had a couple of drinks last night with Tommy Wood, and I know you two on the Terps. You can still have a good day. That's what I want. My psychology needs that. Someone who has more of an engineering brain and a data brain may not need that as much, right? Like, I don't know what you think on that, but I kind of feel like people that are that kind of engineering, numbers, data people, they compartmentalize a little bit more, and they kind of just go, don't, and they're not too worried about the, feeling like they haven't, that they're suboptimal. Whereas I need okay, you're still going to have a good day, mate.
Yeah. And I'm the same, honestly. So
yeah,
there's a lot I like about the Whoop as well, and have had an Aura ring intermittently and some other things. And the main, so what happened to me, and it sounds like it's very similar to you, is like, I'm having trouble falling asleep, and then I'm thinking, oh man, when I wake up in the morning, I'm always going to tell me that I slept really badly. And then it does, and then that negatively affects your ability to perform. And those are studies that have been done. Like, you can manipulate how much people think they've slept, and it affects their mood regardless of how much they actually slept, and it affects their cognitive function. So I think there are absolutely, whenever I talk about this stuff, there are some people who are like, that's not me. I find this really helpful. I can look for trends over time. And you're right. It tends to be sort of very analytical people who can completely objectify, they remove all emotion from the process.
Yeah.
And great. I mean, absolutely. But and please use it in that way. Of course, I wouldn't stop you if you find it helpful. But my guess is that some majority of people don't behave like that, because we know how much these sort of subjective things can give us like placebo and nocebo effects, and that's kind of what I'm worried about. Part of it is also, so when you think about recovery scores or HRV scores or things like that, most of them are not really strongly validated. Like, they're internally created, and this doesn't mean that they're wrong, but they haven't really been compared to some like hard outcome data. So that makes me a little bit wary of some of them. And as these tools and devices get built out and they generate large data sets, that will absolutely become a problem of the past. But then some of it is also like, just because you haven't, so you've had experts on HRV and stuff like that and on the podcast in the past, so I won't go into it too much, but we know that something like HRV, it doesn't tell you how well you can perform, it tells you what the cost of a given performance is going to be physiologically, right? So people often perform at their best right when they're about to get really sick. And when their HIV is tanked, they perform incredibly well, but then there's a large cost to that performance. So I think some of it is also interpreting the data, right? If you're poorly recovered, it doesn't mean that you can't perform well, but that's how we interpret it. But what it means is that on that day when you have low HRV and you have poor recovery, if you're going to go do some like incredibly intense, like adaptation driving session, like an overreach session of some kind, it's going to have a larger physiologic cost. That doesn't mean you can't perform well. So part of it is also like how we're interpreting the data that we're getting.
Yeah. I think the thing that's really stuck with me from what you said is really just looking at how we objectify so much that we miss the joy and the moment almost. Like we're so concerned about optimizing performance with objective data that we're actually missing the meal right in front of us and the people that are right with us now. And it's that kind of mindset shift of being a little bit more present, being okay with who you are today.
Yeah.
And this whole push, high performance. And look, it's me. I've been that forever. And it's kind of like you go, I've actually had to work on it. I've had to work on these things. And I'd love actually, in your experience, what are some of the sort of practical ways that we can develop the ability to, have a life that when things aren't going planned, we can still have a good life?
Yeah. So I think a lot of it for me just stems from this idea of knowing that you can perform well despite difficult circumstances. And so in order to do that, you have to expose yourself to difficult circumstances. And that's one of the takeaways of the coddling of the American mind, is that one thing that's happened with parenting and schools and in general in universities is we have removed this exposure of having to interact with other people who are different from we are and think differently and have different political, philosophical views. And that's almost actively discouraged now in many large sort of academic centers. And that's kind of, I think, helped to precipitate a lot of the issues that we see with being generally intolerant of others and finding people who have alternative views to be very stressful and an exposure that we don't want to be, that we don't want to interact with at all. We would just like completely ban them from whatever it is, when I actually think that being exposed to that and having those conversations is beneficial, because it's a hard thing to do. But then it's the same with physical activity and regular exercise is a hard thing to do. And, all these other things that we've talked about. I think there's benefit from knowing that we can do well under suboptimal conditions. And then that just means intermittently exposing ourselves to those things so that we have that knowledge. And then you become confident in yourself to then be able to do that as you need.
It's interesting, isn't it? I feel like we've worked so hard as a society to create this, optimal living conditions for everybody, right? Like this coddling of the American mind. And the people that haven't read it, please go read it. But it's like we've coddled and we've tried to create these safe spaces and make sure that there's no stress if we can. And look, for some of it comes with good intentions. Exactly. Yeah. It's good intentions, but it's like there's a massive risk of losing our natural resilience to anything. I mean, even with, coming out of those COVID 2 years, I was talking to Laura about this morning, and, we weren't sick for 2 years, any sickness, right? And then, boy, 2022, the common colds wiped me out big time and time again. And my body was like, oh, we're not used to fighting anything. What are you talking about? And that was just on my own personal experience of it all. And finally, I feel now by the end of 2023, I get the common cold. It's not too bad, and away I go. But I felt like 2022, the sicknesses we got were brutal because we stopped being around each other for a couple of years.
There's an interesting part of that, which relates to some of the things I mentioned earlier, that sort of either social isolation or feeling like you have a low social rank, which is a subjective feeling. The subjective feeling is more important than the actual like quantifiable social rank, depending on how you want to quantify it. What it does is it shifts the way your immune system functions away from an immune system that's well attuned to things like communicable viruses, right? Because when you're socially isolated, you've got nobody to expose you to the cold because you've got like nobody around you. So your immune system becomes less good at dealing with colds and viruses and better at dealing with things like acute injuries. Your healing is better, but long term, if you activate that state for a long period of time, that is associated with greater overall stress responses and greater sort of baseline levels of inflammation. So the reason why I'm saying this is because one sort of like hypothesized downside of the social isolation through COVID is that we actually en masse decreased our ability to handle viruses, because that's the shift that naturally happens in the immune system when we become socially isolated. So it's just like an unintended consequence that I think was interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And it's like we, as athletes, you're constantly trying to put yourself in a state of duress, and you try and overcome that state to become stronger. And we need to be doing that for our brains, for our overall health. We need to be challenging ourselves often and repeatedly. And yet we're a society that are trying to put ourselves in cotton wool the whole time. So what are the steps to help society, allow some difficult things to happen, but do it in a way that's still maybe manageable, so people are, I don't know, like it's like, obviously I'm not saying I want people on the street and desperate, and there's so many good things we're doing in the world, like trying to reduce poverty and hunger, and of course, right? But tell me if this is right. Laura was sharing with me that the generation that went through the Depression and the Great Wars, their gut biomes and their resiliency is so strong because of the amount of fasting and the uncleanliness and everything else they had to go through. They're actually more resilient than, say, our generation. By the time we get into our 80s, we're going to be in a bit of trouble. Is that true? Any word? Is that?
Hypothetically, it makes a lot of sense, because we know that biological systems become more resilient and their function increases proportional to the stress that's placed on them, essentially up to a point, right? You can have so much stress that the whole system breaks down. Like if, say, an athlete overtraining, right, would be a relatable example.
Yes.
But equally, we live in the safest, healthiest time for the human species ever.
Yeah.
Right. So like you say, there's a whole bunch of great things that have happened, and a lot of what we can do to offset some of the negative effects of being constantly safe, constantly warm, constantly fed, constantly sedentary, is that we have to build some of these things back in. And I think that's where some of the real interest in some of these tools like fasting, hot and cold exposure, the optimal exercise program to improve VO2 max and grip strength and all these things associated with longevity. Right, we're building back in these stresses that we've essentially engineered out of our lives, and so I think that's where they start to become beneficial, is so that we can create those adaptations that are almost expected by our physiology, but which we manage to completely get rid of. And there's been some interesting papers where similar points have been made that kind of all align with this idea. So Charles Brenner, who's an expert in like NAD metabolism, which is a very hot topic in terms of aging, he wrote a review paper, and what he mentioned was that in animal studies and maybe some human studies, caloric restriction is supposed to be very beneficial for long-term health. But in reality, that's only because we now live in a society where we can all overeat continuously. It's not that caloric restriction is beneficial, it's that caloric excess is damaging, and that's kind of the baseline. now. And Inigo San Millan, who's very popular nowadays around Zone 2 and related training, he wrote a paper about physical activity and basically said the same thing, which is that we started to talk about physical activity as this beneficial intervention, but it's just because we've engineered physical activity out of our environment. It's the lack of physical activity that's damaging, not that we have to engineer it back in. And I think it's the same for things like cognitive stimulation. Actually using our brains in the ways that we use them historically, which changes as we get older. And back in the day, if we think about some idealized tribal or kind of group scenario going back a few hundred or thousands of years, right? As people get older, they become the sources of wisdom and the teachers, and right, they're the repositories of knowledge. Whereas nowadays, as people get older, they're no longer contributing to the economy, so they just get locked up in a nursing home, and they don't get to use their experience in the way that they could have done historically. And of course, that's massively oversimplified, but it kind of gives you the idea that we've engineered out these very human activities that drive beneficial adaptations in our physiology, and through that give us long-term health. So we now have to build them back in as interventions rather than just them being part of how we live our lives, which is what it was historically.
Yeah, that's really well put, though, isn't it? It's funny. I put fasting on this list that I wanted to talk to you about because the other day, it occurred to me, a bit to your point, I'd engineered this whole fasting out of my life. That I work from home, the kitchen's literally about 6 feet away, and I realized I had a bit of an addiction just to food. And my weight's okay, and I work out and everything else, and it's not bad food. But I was like, hang on, I think this is an addiction. So I fasted because I thought it was an addiction, not because I was after. Laura's like, oh, you should do a blood test before and check what. I said, no. It's for the mental side. I need to go 72 hours just drinking water. And I think I had a little bit of bone broth. You might say I'm cheating, but anyway, that was the plan. 72 hours with bone broth on the afternoon of day 2 and the afternoon of day 3. And it was brutal. I got to tell you, I was so pathetic. I did it, and I'm proud that I did it. I'm proud that I did it because it was hard. It was really hard. Yeah. And people are like, oh, Greg, how amazing did you feel after? I'm like, no, I didn't feel any different. I just felt better because I felt like I brought a little bit of discipline back in my life. And I want I want to own my physical. I as much as I can. And I felt like I'd been a slave to the kitchen and the food. Yeah. And it was like that little bit, I need to find the right balance here. And I don't know. I recommend everybody give this stuff a go just to see how you feel. It would have been much easier had I done it, in a wilderness retreat somewhere where I wasn't in my, having to cook for the kids and, sit around the dinner table while everybody ate. But it was something I really enjoyed doing. Do you do it? Do you fast yourself at all?
I don't. I have done some extended fasts historically. I think the longest one I did was 3 days.
Yeah.
But I don't. And the main reason is that I don't think there's anything physiologically magic about fasting. And like you said, that's not what you think either. It's the cognitive and the control you've regained over your eating habits, that's where you saw most of the benefit. And that's where I think this can be beneficial, is this. And where we often see issues with long-term mental and other health is where we lose control of something. It could be how we interact with technology. It can be how we interact with food. It can be how we interact with
everything, mate. Everything. Yeah.
So physically regaining control is incredibly beneficial in those scenarios. So I have a number of friends who do active research in this arena, and a lot of what we're sold in terms of the active benefits of fasting are related to studies in mice. And then when you try and replicate those findings in humans, we don't see the same thing at all. So I don't think that fasting does anything particularly magic. But in terms of regaining control in some area and knowing that you've done a hard thing, I think there's great benefit there. So in terms of the adaptations that you get from things like fasting, you also get those particularly from aerobic exercise, and probably much faster. So if I'm thinking about physiologic adaptation, I'm more concerned about my physical activity than I am about fasting. But equally, I go through periods where I manipulate what my diet looks like. So when I'm building up towards a competition, I eat more calories. The quality of my diet probably decreases slightly so that I can consume more, so I can put on some weight, a bit more muscle mass, right? That's important when I'm competing in strongman. Then afterwards, I'll do the opposite. I'll generally decrease my caloric intake, increase my protein intake, and I'll generally, sort of manipulate my body composition that way. So I certainly apply some of these sort of dietary tools to my advantage when I need them to, one way or another. But fasting, just for me, isn't one that I use frequently. Interesting.
I mean, I love the idea that physical aerobic activity can have the same sort of effects. I did watch this is where I do my study on the YouTube, and yeah, right. This is normal. So I'm going to pose the question, but he was an Indian fellow who, cardiac surgeon, and maybe you know who I'm talking about, but he was something about if you can fast for a 7-day fast and the fact that it could have a 70% reduction in cancer growth. Any truth to that?
I've heard talk of that study. That's basically not true.
Way to just kill it.
so it is more new. So I'll come in all guns blazing, and then
good.
Some nuance. So in general, there's no evidence for that in humans, literally at all. But for certain cancer types, manipulating metabolism is a very promising area of current research. So there are some small studies that fasting around chemotherapy can maybe offset some of the negative side effects of chemo.
Okay.
There are some studies on ketogenic diet, so dramatically decreasing carbohydrate intake, and there's maybe benefit from ketones themselves, but also decreasing glucose access to the cancers may help augment responses. And this is kind of, the trials are being run right now. So I'm not saying that this is the thing to do yet. There are also things like glycolysis inhibitors. So you're inhibiting the ability of cancer cells to use glucose as an energy source, and that could maybe augment some treatment. So certainly manipulating substrate availability, glucose levels, fasting, I think they may have a role to play in cancer therapy in the future. Mm-hmm. We're right at the beginning of that. Certainly some interesting studies going on. And I understand why, people who need to worry about that right now may try some of those things. And in many cases, it may be worth trying in sort of collaboration with your doctor, but we don't have great evidence yet, but certainly a lot of promise.
Well done. You brought it, you came all the way around, didn't you? No, that was great though. No, I'm glad I asked, because it's an interesting one. And, I found this last year, we got a brand new Lifetime fitness gym down here in Florida, and it's absolutely fantastic. And what's really cool about it is I never realized so many people were into fitness and working out. And that when I'm in the sauna post-workout, everybody in there is listening to Andrew Huberman, right? He's the number 3 podcast in the world right now. That's unbelievable. Yeah. He's doing fantastic.
Amazing. Just that essentially a professor can get that reach, I think is incredible.
Yes. And I'm always he doesn't have any kids. He doesn't really know. I'm always all right, he's good, but until he has kids, I don't want to hear from him. But look, and not put no pressure on you to have kids either, Tommy. I'm just saying. But everybody in there is quoting Huberman, right? And it's amazing. Oh, I'm doing my 4 by 20 minutes sauna with 5-minute ice bath, and I'm who has
maximize growth hormone release?
Yeah, firstly, again, if you don't have kids, that kind of thing maybe is on the cards. But the rest of us are just crank the thing up. I've got 15 minutes. I want to sweat, and then I got 2 minutes to plunge in the ice bath.
Yeah.
But talking hot cold therapy, can we talk hot cold therapy? What are your kind of thoughts on it. What are the latest sort of insights and developments that you've come across in this kind of, as we're all trying to human growth hormone or hit dopamines in the ice bath or everything else? What are your thoughts on it all?
Yeah. As a Scandinavian native, obviously hot and cold is baked into my physiology, and it's something that I really enjoy. Just built a new gym at home, and there's a space where the sauna and the cold plunge are going to go sometime very soon. So these are things that I really enjoy.
By the way, quickly, what are you getting? Which sauna, which ice bath? Because I want to know.
Oh, I think I'm gonna get them both from Redwood Outdoors. I have no relationship with them as a company, but they're local.
Oh, okay.
They use local Washington cedar, which
beautiful.
is like a very nice wood. And so for those reasons, that's why.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt.
But equally, get a $20 kiddie pool that you can fill with cold water and buy, and you can buy a pretty decent sauna from Costco. Nowadays.
Yeah. So, those little barrel ones and everything. I think I have them.
Yeah, exactly. So what was I saying? So I do think there's benefit to these things. I do worry a little bit that some of the benefit is overhyped, and mainly because there's been this like huge focus on things like growth hormone release and this kind of stuff. And what we've learned, particularly from the exercise literature, and I expect this to be very similar, is that acute changes in hormones basically mean nothing for long-term outcomes. So like people talked about, well, if you do this type of exercise, you get this spike in testosterone and that will support muscle growth.
If you do squats, your testosterone's going to go through the roof. Yeah.
It's just not like that bump in hormones doesn't affect the outcome literally at all. So I'm not a big fan of saying do this because you'll increase this hormone by X amount, because I think we've learned several times now that never really pans out to be the important thing. So then we can talk about hot and cold separately, but actually, if anybody's really interested in this, I just did a podcast on my podcast, which is the Better Brain Fitness podcast, where we talked about sauna and dementia in particular, because there is some work published on that. But basically, almost all the long-term health outcome data on sauna comes from one study of male Finnish businessmen in the 80s. And basically what they found was that the more time these guys spent in the sauna every week, the lower their risk of dementia and the lower their risk of all-cause mortality, such that those who went in the sauna 4 to 7 times a week had a 2/3 reduction in their risk of death and dementia.
Wow.
And that amount of benefit is just, it is unbelievable. That cannot be true. What I think is happening is that there's some what we call residual confounding, which is that those people who are able to go to the sauna more frequently, right, have other things that are also benefiting their health long term. And so when you look at the data, like the guys who are spending, and it is guys, it was only men, guys who were in the high frequency sauna group, they were younger, they were healthier, they were fitter. And I think that, they adjust for that statistically, but I think they just haven't accounted for all that. So I think that the benefit is overhyped, but there is still likely to be some benefit, because we know that heat exposure can improve blood sugar control. It may augment some of the responses to physical activity or training. It actually has sort of cardiovascular benefits very similar to aerobic exercise. And again, your heart rate's increasing, your peripheral vasculature is dilated because you're trying to offload heat. So that's actually very similar in many ways to the heart benefits of doing exercise. So there are lots, and then like sweating is important because it's one of our detoxification mechanisms. So I think there's a lot of reasons why it can be beneficial, but I think some of the benefits are slightly overblown.
Yeah, I would agree. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, so then with that is cold exposure. And again, a lot of the research has kind of compared people who use cold exposure a lot, like cold water swimmers, again, generally in Scandinavia, compared to control groups. And they see some things like they have like changes in acute metabolism, better responses to cold, where they upregulate their energy metabolism more efficiently through brown fat. But also, these at baseline, these groups are different, right? They tended to be leaner. They tended to have slightly better health. And then, like, is it that it's the better health that's driving some of this, or is it that the cold water exposure is driving the improvements in health? And right now, it's kind of difficult to untangle that. But one thing that does seem to be fairly consistent in the literature, and again, they're just sort of right at the beginning of this, is the improvements in terms of mental health, and even just acute single cold water exposure seems to improve feelings of well-being and mood. And I think long term, it's very possible that the cold stress creates oxidative stress, and then you become better at handling oxidative stress, like you upregulate your antioxidant mechanism. So that's one of several reasons why it may be beneficial. So I think there's some good stuff on mood, and some of it may be the acute release of endorphins and stuff like that. But some of it, I think, is also going to come from knowing that you did a hard thing. Right? Yes. We've already talked about that, right? You've done something which is quite unpleasant, and you know that you survived it. What's interesting is that, having listened to people who know this field better than me talk about it, the dose is probably not as much for cold. It's probably not as much as you might think. So one guy who's written some papers, has done a whole bunch of research in this arena, basically said that all you have to do to get the majority of the benefits from cold water exposure are I think the water has to be less than 18 degrees Celsius, which is 60 something Fahrenheit. And you get in just until you can relax again, right? The first thing that you sort of like, you start to hyperventilate and you sort of like scrunch up because of the cold. You sort of like get all tense. As soon as you sort of just like relax into it and can start to breathe normally again, that's enough, right? So that could be seconds. You don't have to have freezing water that you expose yourself to for 20 minutes, right? So at least in his work, the dose is probably much less than people expect, or the might see elsewhere. So I think there's definitely benefit to both. Why that benefit is probably deserves some debate, and the benefit is often overhyped. But again, I think for various reasons, they drive some physiologic adaptations that are probably beneficial, but also doing hard and unpleasant things, I think is good for us. And that's two good examples. Yeah,
I couldn't agree with you more on the doing something unpleasant. It's funny. My protocol for both sauna and ice bath is take myself to the edge, right?
Yeah.
And not always though, because I find I can push myself quite a long way, and I love the pushing and being on the edge. And it's like, sometimes that can be to a real detriment. Like you get sick, but I've noticed with the ice bath, depending on what I'm trying to do that day, if I have a podcast that I think is going to be maybe require me to be a little bit more focused and on, I tend to sit in the ice bath right until I get just a little bit of a chill going on that'll take me for a few hours, that kind of alertness that you get from being chilled. But then I've been doing it for so much that I almost felt like I wasn't getting the dopamine and endorphin effect anymore. I'd get out and I'm like, my mood hadn't changed at all. I felt good because I'd done something. So then I took a couple of months off it, went back in, and then now I'm like, well, I need to challenge myself something more. Now the one at the club it's maybe 45 or something. It's not terrible, but so now I go under and I do breath control work, and go, okay, count to 150 or 200 as long as you can, just like I have to try and find something else. And then somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, oh no, Gary Brecker or one of the, says, you're freezing your brain and you shouldn't be going underwater. Is there any truth to that, by the way? I'm talking to the right person.
Yeah, I'm not worried about that at all.
Okay. How do these things get on the internet, mate? I'm telling you, I don't know.
I don't know. I think, right, if we step back a second, and to be fair, I'm not really familiar with Gary Brecker's work, but I think some of what he says is that some of these, like, we're talking about these beneficial stressors, and he's like, we're taking it too far. It's too stressful on the body.
Right.
And I think there is some truth to that. like often when I think about how amateurs exercise, they often assume that they have to go and like crush themselves for an hour.
Right.
And they're doing like a bunch of like threshold work if they're doing aerobic training, or like they're going and doing CrossFit and just like smashing the wads out. And just,
more
like,
is better. More is better.
More is better. And like that is, I don't think that's the case. That stuff can be very difficult to recover from.
Yeah.
Local to me is Joel Jameson, who's like an expert in a bunch of these physiologic adaptations, and I know that he's looked at thousands of people's of data, and like that kind of training seems to be the most demanding on the cardiovascular system with the least net benefit if you don't recover from it properly. So I think there is something there. And then related to that, there was an interesting study where they looked at sauna, and it was a high sauna exposure, but they took people and they exposed them, I think it was an hour of sauna twice a day for a week. And
wow,
in the women, 5, and it was a small study, so it was like 7 women were in this study, but in the women, they reported that 5 of the 7 had a delay in their menstrual cycle of 2 to 5 weeks.
Whoa.
So it is, right, these things are stressors and we can overdo it. And I think this is, right, more is not more. And it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the research on hot and cold exposure was only done in men and was not done particularly in premenopausal cycling women, where we know the system is very sensitive to fluctuations in energy input and, total energy output and all these other stresses. So I think that there is some takeaway that says that, yes, some stress is beneficial. And I would say that some stress using these tools is necessary for long-term health, but more is not more. And often people who do a lot of it tend to do or can lean into doing too much of it.
Yes, I'm putting my hands up. I'm nodding my head on that one. Well, it's more, you got to peer over the edge and maybe go a step too far to know where the edge is. And it's, and it's a hard one. When you try to listen to your body and you're trying to figure it out, and some days the body's giving you great signals, and other days you're kind of like, was that a signal? And you just bolt right through it, right? And I don't know. I feel like these days as an athlete or as a father, husband, and just somebody who turns up at the gym, works out for 45 minutes a day and then does some sauna and icing, I have a better kind of gauge compared to when you're an athlete and you tend to overdo it. I mean, you're still in the space where you're competing and, world's strongest man. How's that going, by the way? You mentioned that.
I didn't compete this year. Some timing issues came up with the ability to do competitions. I'm probably, I'll see, but I'm in this weird gray area where I can't really compete as a novice anymore. But if I compete in the open category, I'm not strong enough. At my body weight, just because there's just some complete monsters that you go up against. And I don't care about winning, but I care about being able to do the tasks that are set, right? Yeah. It's no fun if it's a max rep deadlift and you can't do it once.
Yeah.
But then next year I turn 40 and I can compete as a master. So I'll probably compete again next autumn, fall.
Happy 40th for next year.
Thanks.
Wow, that's very cool. I can't believe you're still in your 30s. My goodness.
Or is it because I'm so grizzled and haggard?
I was going to say so wise, but okay, we can go with the previous. I want to just finish up on, people are probably tired of me talking about it on the podcast, but I found it to be really quite a breakthrough for me over this past couple of years. And it started during COVID 2020. And I really started practicing gratitude hard every morning. And what I remember that is not just going out and go, I'm grateful for the weather and the running water and, the house and the home. And I do all of that, but really feeling what I say, that I can almost feel it in my gut when I truly go, you feel whether it's a hormonal release or you can tell me, but I've found that it's helped me with a massive slap of perspective. Yeah. And when I start every day with that, and I do try and do it every day, and to your point earlier, it's like, yeah, some days I miss, and it's like, okay, I can still have a good day, and maybe I'll do it a bit later in the day or whatever. But it's been really amazing to start the day triggering the brain in such a way that gets me to neutral, and I can feel so good about everything. And then on top of that gratitude, I also, then visualize the future. And, that's hard when I'm actually, if you've just done gratitude, it's hard to actually shift the gear and go, oh, and I'm also going to push for this, this, and this. A bit, again, what we've sort of talked about, optimizing life. And I kind of go, actually, after you practice gratitude, you kind of often go, life is awesome. What am I chasing? And then I finish by walking into the house going, this could be my last day. How you want to live it, right? It's like that. I love that. It's kind of, okay, it feels really good. Mm-hmm. Is this an area that you practice on? Is it an area that you've done any research on? How gratitude can affect well-being and your mental health?
I've, certainly explored it academically a little bit, just because when you exist in these health-related worlds and have interest in neuroscience, it's obviously something that comes up a lot. And I think that it fits well into, and each of these is different in their own way, but it sort of fits into the group of these practices that help build distress tolerance, say. And so I think meditation and certain types of mindfulness can come into this as well. And part of it is just, I think, some of it is, right, if you think about all the things and people you're grateful for, you're going to release oxytocin and all these other things that we know are very good for the brain and various other aspects of health in terms of stress responses, right? So there's a direct physiological effect. But it's also this sort of moment, time spent in the moment is, for various reasons seems to be particularly good for us because we spend so much time outside of ourselves and thinking about the future and what we can do and what we can achieve. So sort of grounding ourselves in that, I think has a number of benefits. And there's a lot of debate in terms of what's the best way to do it and all this kind of stuff. And I'm not sure I really have the perfect answer there, but intentionality certainly seems to be a common factor. It sounds like you're doing this in a very intentional manner, whereas I think a lot of people can just pay lip service to this, right? I have my daily journal, and I do it in an app, and it asks me these questions, and I quickly write them down, and hey, I've done my gratitude, and that's going to be good for me today. And I don't think that's the same thing. So I think your intentionality makes a big difference there. And I think that link to visualization, which I know is something else that you potentially want to talk about, is interesting because that kind of the difficulty switching from one of gratitude to visualization very nicely demonstrates one of the potential downsides of visualization, which has been largely popularized by a psychologist called Gabrielle Oettingen, and she wrote a book called Rethinking Positive Thinking. And basically what she found was that when you imagine all these amazing things happening for you and you go like win the lottery and you're going to be rich and famous and all this kind of stuff, when you do that and you visualize yourself succeeding in a goal, you decrease motivation to actually do the things that are required to achieve the goal.
Because you've already done it.
Because like in your mind, you've already done it. And actually like neurochemically, there is some like you're already celebrating the achievement without putting in the hard work to do it. So you're less likely to actually do the work. So the important thing in that context, and it's not the same as visualization in sports or learning, which we can talk about as well. But the important thing is in that context, is to visualize the obstacles and the things you need to do in order to achieve your goal rather than visualize yourself achieving the goal, if that makes sense. So, and that's where, there's the Oettingen WHOOP process, which includes identifying goals and then obstacles and pre-preparing yourself for how you'll navigate the obstacles to then achieve your goal. So
I like that.
Visualize the process rather than the end goal, at least in that context. Because if all you're doing is just like thinking, all these amazing things are going to happen, which is what you've done with gratitude, and that's a good thing in that context. But in terms of then striving to achieve a certain goal, what you're visualizing makes a big difference.
That's well put. I like that. Yes, I think we all get caught up in the outcome goals and standing on top of the staircase and go, woohoo, that was awesome. The visualizing. It's like, actually, no, focus on those process oriented goals and the obstacles you can face. I really like that. I've had some time recently where I've been using AI, and I'd say, look, for other people's companies, not my own, show me the success, for a friend's company that they're working on in 5 years' time, and write a newspaper article demonstrating the outcome of their success, that they've got, 5,000 subscribers and they got this, and this, and talk about some of the obstacles they faced to achieve their goals and the hurdles that they had to, and AI is amazing. It'll come up with this whole newspaper article. Yeah. I then copy that and put it into a Canva template, with a newspaper article, put the images in. Okay, I've got a bit of time on my hands. And then send that over to them. So I can do this for you, right? It takes me 20 minutes and I can send this. And it's actually a really cool thing to go, okay, 5 years' time, Forbes Business Magazine has Dr. Tommy Wood, blah, 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 blah. Here's all the things that he had to overcome over the last 5 years. And it's been a lot of fun using AI and then all the tools at my disposal to take visualizing and, to your point, the process and the hurdles. Yeah. And actually putting it in and look, whatever. It's a bit silly, but I kind of like that I'm a bit of a futurist. I like to look into the future and I like to dream a little bit. So I've always been somewhat of a visualizer, but I like the hard work and the journey as well. But mate, this has been really great. This has been really fantastic. How much time have I got with you? You got to run?
Yeah, we can keep going. Well, that's a dangerous thing to say.
No. I actually just want to wrap up. I don't know if you did this last time, but I figure we could probably throw these at you again now, and they're just the final 4 questions. Okay, so first one. What would you tell your 18-year-old self?
Whenever people answer these kinds of questions, I think that they often think about them from like the standpoint of regrets, right? And not all. I'm the painting with a broad brush, but if I think back, there are obviously things that I regret, and the vast majority of them are when I treated somebody in a way that I would now wish that I hadn't. It's usually interactions with other people in the way that you approach that. At least for me, that's what I regret. But very broadly, there's not that much stuff that I would tell my 18-year-old self, because that person ended up where I am today, and that's pretty great.
I think you just say, be yourself.
Yeah, and of course, it sucked a bunch along the way, but so I can, right, like it does for everybody. But so I can think, well, if my 18, if I was 18, but in today's world, so I thought about it that way.
Okay, yeah.
And the reason for that is I think that there have been shifts in the way that younger generations approach things. And so there are 2 things that I would say. One is to be patient. And if I think back 10 or now 20 years, right? If I go back to my 18-year-old self, there are times when you're like, I wish that I was invited to do this thing, or I wish that somebody would recognize my expertise in this thing, or I wish that I was doing this. And if you keep focused on your values and doing the right kind of work, you'll end up there. It just takes a long time, right? Mm-hmm. Necessarily. So that's I think patience is one thing. And then the next thing is I would just say, because I think that, like we talked about, maybe there's less of this happening nowadays broadly, just like do difficult things, regardless of what they are. I think that's an important piece of advice for pretty much anybody, especially as we engineer difficult things out of our environment. And I've done like physical, mental, other things that were very difficult, and I think that's one of the reasons I've been able to, achieve what I have.
I like that. Do difficult things. That'll be the name of this podcast. I like it. That's really cool. All right, next one. Who are 3 people you'd love to have for dinner? ideally non-family, but living or dead. Can be anybody. It's hard.
I had a list of 3, and then before we started recording, we were talking about Arnold Schwarzenegger. I think I would include him. I'd love to have dinner with him. So then the other 2 that I would add are the author Bill Bryson. I think I just love the way he tells stories about everyday life, which I think is fascinating. Like one of like A Brief History of Nearly Everything, which is basically a history of science told in a sort of a novel style way, is like one of the best books I've ever read. And he's done the same for various parts of the UK and about the human body, and I just think that's fascinating.
Cool.
And then the third person, so left on my list were Ludovico Einaudi, who's an Italian composer whose music I love and is everywhere, even without maybe people realizing it. And a sneaky fourth would be Omar Sy, the actor who's in probably my favorite film of all time, which is called The Untouchables. So I'm gonna that's gonna be a tie for the last.
That's right. I'll let you have 4. And didn't you just go? You said you just went to Handel and Messiah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what you do every year. That's a Christmas thing.
I've done that every year at Christmas. I mean, probably for 20 years. I mean, we missed a couple of years like COVID and some other things, but I've seen it all over the world.
No way.
All kinds of different arrangements. It's
powerful music, isn't it? But it's also powerful music. My mum, who's 7, I won't say her age. She's getting older. And it was a lifelong dream of hers to join the choir. And she did she was part of the Sydney choir at the Sydney Town Hall this last weekend. Actually, she's flying over here right now.
Cool.
But she got to be the choir in the Messiah, the Handel, and just absolutely loved it. So when I saw you put that on Instagram the other day, I was like, there we go. That's so cool. All right, next one. Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I honestly don't know, because I've never had a plan. Everything's just I just kind of bumble along and fall into things. But in 5 years' time, what kind of, I'd like to spend more time working in like the applied science of improving people's cognitive function and treating brain injury in those at highest risk. So like military and then dementia patients, actually have like direct impact there and build some evidence that people can apply for themselves. And I'd like to write a book and hopefully have that book do well. So maybe I'll put that on my 5-year list. But other than that, like where I'll be, what my job will be, probably can't predict it, because I'm not sure. I'll probably still be here doing the same job, but you never know.
I think there'll be many more doors opening for you. It's hard to say, isn't it? Sometimes you don't want to plan the 5 years. It's actually nice to just go, I don't know.
Yeah.
It could be interesting. All right. Now, this next question is not a morbid question. It's an exciting question. If you had 6 months to live, how would you use your remaining days?
I think my answer would probably be fairly typical, but some portion of it would be travel and experiences. There are places around the world I'd like to go. In particular, there's a lot of things I'd like to eat, and not think too hard about the downstream
consequences
of that consumption, which is something that you could certainly be afforded with 6 months to live. So I've never really traveled in Asia or South America, but basically when I think about places I'd like to travel, I would like to eat the things that they have there. That's the main thing I think about. I'd like do sort of Anthony Bourdain style travel. I'd love to do that, and then you quit your job and spend as much time as you can with your loved ones and family, which would require some travel for me too, because they're sort of spread around. But those would be my two main things.
I love it. I hope you don't get barley belly on your first day in Asia. takes out a month. You're like, damn it.
Yeah, you don't have much time. Then that would be unfortunate.
Oh, mate. Hey, you want to? I'm going to do just a couple of rapid fire questions because I'm actually just curious on some of the answers. All right. And this one, you've already mentioned a couple of books, but one book that you would gift to anybody. Is it that one? Brian Bryson?
I would probably, there's a couple, maybe depending on the person. I really like the Moth short stories. And like they're good. Another fabulous book of short stories I would give to anybody is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. Just amazing. Highly recommended to anybody. Then if somebody was more of a nonfiction kind of person, I would give them The Coddling of the American Mind or Behave by Robert Sapolsky.
Thanks, mate. I go through Audible books like you wouldn't believe, so it's always nice to, and I have regifted The Coddling of the American Mind. I do think it was an outstanding book that you put me onto last time we were on, and so very cool. All right, one movie that's really impressed you that we should go watch.
If people haven't seen The Untouchables, I highly recommend it. My favorite film of all time, probably. It was remade recently, so it's the original is in French, and it is slightly funnier if you speak some French, but still amazing. Just because there are some things that there's one, I think I like one joke that only rhymes in French, so it's not as funny when you see the translation.
Right, yeah.
But so it was remade. It was called The Upside. It had Bryan Cranston and Kevin Hart in it. But the original is much better, although that one is also pretty good. So, and it's just like super heartwarming, very funny. Ludovico Einaudi, who is going to be at my dinner party, his music makes up a lot of the soundtrack. So just great film.
All right, buddy. Mate, this has been really fantastic. I love our chats. Both online and offline. And I know your time is valuable. And I believe you even recorded a podcast right before coming onto this one. So you've been talking for a long time today. You're probably and I know you do them always standing up. Are you standing up still?
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. So you've been standing up for hours. But always, mate, I just thoroughly enjoy your clarity and insights into often what I think we sometimes overcomplicate maybe. But you have a way of taking these kind of things that we all look at as complicated as quite simplistic, to be honest. And it's really refreshing. So I really appreciate you spending the time and coming on and chatting with me again. It's been a blast.
Yeah, massive pleasure as usual. I really appreciate the invite and the time talking to you. Really enjoyed it.
All right. For everybody listening, you can find all the show notes at bennettendurance.com/media. All right. It's down the line, mate. Cheers.
Yeah.